Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We take your reading and, well, we boil it down to the core ideas, the really fascinating stuff.
That's the plan.
So this time, you send us the final chapter of Man and His Symbols. It's called Science and the Unconscious.
Right. A really thought-provoking piece.
It seems like it's trying to connect our inner world,
Yeah.
the symbolic stuff, with the outer world of science. That sounds pretty ambitious, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. This chapter, it's kind of the capstone. It tries to bridge these two realms that usually feel so separate, our personal unconscious landscape and the, let's say, objective reality science looks at.
Yeah.
And we're going to dig into how they might be maybe more connected than we think.
Intriguing. So maybe we should quickly recap the basics from the book first.
No.
What's the absolute core idea? And, where does this chapter say we stand on understanding the unconscious and archetypes?
Good starting point. So the whole book really hinges on this idea that our unconscious psyche is constantly creating symbols. It's like its native language. And this final chapter really underscores that, look, we're still just scratching the surface of understanding this unconscious world, especially these basic patterns, the archetypes. We're really only beginning to grasp how deep their influence runs.
And these archetypes, they're not just like abstract concepts. The book suggests they have a real tangible impact on us.
Oh, absolutely. Think of them as sort of the hidden architects of our psyche. They shape so much our emotions, our ethics, how we see the world, our relationships, even, the path our life takes. These deep patterns are incredibly influential.
Hidden architects. I like that. The chapter also mentions something about wholeness, right? That these symbols often point towards wholeness and can even be healing. How does that work?
Well, the idea is the psyche naturally wants to be integrated, balanced, like striving for equilibrium.
Makes sense.
And these archetypal symbols often emerge in ways that reflect that drive towards wholeness. So when we start to engage with them, understand them, it can help bring different parts of ourselves together.
Like integrating conflicting parts.
Exactly, leading to a kind of psychological healing, a better sense of well-being.
So the unconscious is sort of nudging us towards becoming more complete versions of ourselves. But there's also a warning, is there, about archetypes being creative and destructive.
Yes, there's a duality. On one hand, they can spark amazing new ideas, fresh insights, they're a source of creativity.
Right.
But if those same patterns become rigid, like fixed prejudices or unquestioned beliefs, if we cling to them too tightly.
And they become limiting.
Exactly, they can stifle growth, block understanding, even lead to destructive actions. So it's about having a fluid relationship with them, not letting them harden into dogma.
That makes a lot of sense, keeping things flexible. Okay, shifting focus a bit.
Yeah.
The chapter really shines a light on Jung's own work, his lifelong dedication to interpreting these symbols. What was his approach like?
Yeah, his whole career was basically this deep dive into the archetypal realm. And it's crucial to remember, like the chapter says, this book is just a tiny glimpse of his massive output. His approach was really marked by subtlety, a real sensitivity to the nuances of symbols, and a deep awareness that just slapping on simple intellectual labels could actually weaken their power.
So it wasn't like creating a universal symbol dictionary.
Not at all. For Jung, interpretation was an art. It needed careful consideration of the individual's context, their culture. He wasn't aiming for a one-size-fits-all key.
The chapter also says Jung saw his concepts as tools or heuristic hypotheses. What does that mean about how he viewed his own ideas?
Well, a heuristic is like a practical tool for exploring, right? Not necessarily the final absolute truth.
Okay.
Jung saw his ideas, the unconscious archetypes, in that light. They were useful frameworks for investigating the psyche, but he knew this was uncharted territory. He kept things open.
So more about opening doors than providing final answers.
Precisely. And speaking of opening things up, the chapter makes this really bold claim. Discovering the unconscious has essentially doubled our view of reality. What does that actually mean?
Think about it like this. For ages, we mostly understood things based on conscious awareness, what science could measure, right?
Sure.
Then suddenly, there's this whole other dimension revealed, the unconscious, a hidden world of thoughts, feelings, instincts, all powerfully influencing our conscious lives and how we even perceive the outside world.
Right.
So now, to really understand anything, personal issues, cultural stuff, even science, You kind of have to factor in both the conscious and the unconscious elements. It adds this whole new layer of depth.
It's like discovering this vast underwater realm beneath the surface we usually see.
Exactly. And following from that, the chapter argues these unconscious forces, these archetypes, they don't just show up in therapy. Where else do they manifest?
Well, the argument is everywhere in human culture. Think mythology, religion, art in all its forms, painting, music, literature.
Even social rituals.
Yes, even collective behaviors. The idea is that these aren't just random cultural artifacts. They're often expressions of these deep shared archetypal themes.
Right, those recurring stories and figures you see across cultures. The hero, the wise old mentor, the great mother.
Exactly. Jung would say these arise from our shared human inheritance, these basic emotional and mental patterns, the archetypes.
Oh.
Since they're so fundamental, they naturally get expressed symbolically in our myths, art, beliefs, actions, all over the place.
Which neatly leads into Jung's influence on other fields. The chapter lists quite a few: literature, history, anthropology. Can you give some examples?
Sure. In literature, Jungian ideas gave critics new ways to look at, say, the deeper symbolic meanings in classics. The chapter mentions studies on Faust, on Hamlet,
Right.
using a Jungian lens to see the timeless psychological stuff going on. In art history, people like Herbert Reed used his ideas to understand the unconscious drives behind creativity, looking at artists like Henry Moore. And even in history, someone like Arnold Toynbee or anthropologists like Paul Radin drew on concepts like the collective unconscious to understand patterns in societies or shared myths. His ideas really spread out.
It's fascinating how these psychological ideas can offer new angles on so many cultural things. But the chapter adds a note of caution, doesn't it? That archetypes aren't the only way to understand art or literature.
Yes, and that's really important. Archetypes can provide this powerful underlying layer, reveal deep unconscious currents, sure. But reducing art just to archetypes, that misses a lot.
Why is that?
Well, art and literature have their own rules, their own aesthetic qualities, and creativity itself often has elements that, you can't fully explain rationally or just through archetypes.
So the archetype is like a foundation.
Kind of. But the actual building, the specific artwork or story, is shaped by so much more: the artist's skill, their culture, their conscious choices. It's a lens, a valuable one, but not the whole picture.
Got it. Okay, now the chapter takes a really unexpected turn, right? Into connections with the natural sciences, biology, and physics. This is where it gets kind of mind-bending.
Definitely. Let's start with biology and this idea of synchronicity.
Okay, synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences. How does that relate to evolution?
Well, this was an area where the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, who worked closely with Jung, saw some really interesting potential links. The standard view of evolution was, random mutation plus natural selection.
Right, survival of the fittest based on random changes.
Exactly. But some scientists started wondering if that could fully explain how quickly some really complex adaptations seem to pop up in the evolutionary record. The timescales seemed maybe a bit tight for just random chance.
So pure randomness felt maybe incomplete for explaining the speed of some changes.
That was the question. And this is where synchronicity enters the picture. Pauli wondered if these meaningful causal coincidences might help understand those rare, improbable evolutionary leaps.
How so?
Like, maybe the activation of an archetype in the collective unconscious could somehow coincide, synchronistically, with a meaningful biological change in a species under pressure.
Whoa, that's a big idea. Linking the psyche and biology in evolution.
It is radical, extremely speculative, of course.
Is there a more down-to-earth example of synchronicity the chapter uses, like that simultaneous invention thing?
Yes, the classic example. Darwin and Wallace independently coming up with the theory of evolution by natural selection.
Right. Different places, same time, basically the same idea.
Exactly. And the chapter notes that both described having this kind of intuitive flash, the core idea crystallizing before all the evidence was perfectly lined up.
The naha
Moment. Pretty much. Seeing that as a synchronistic event suggests maybe an underlying archetypal pattern was sort of ready to emerge in human consciousness then. The chapter calls these acts of creation in time.
Acts of creation in time. Powerful stuff. It also mentions personal, meaningful coincidences, like knowing about a relative's death from afar. How does that connect back to species adaptation?
The link is subtle and, again, very speculative. The idea is if synchronicity can provide vital, non-sensory info to an individual in a moment of need, perhaps, just perhaps, a similar principle could operate at the species level during critical times. When a species is under intense pressure, may be meaningful, but causal physical changes could arise in ways that aren't purely random mutation.
So another potential mechanism beyond randomness, possibly linked to meaning or need.
That's the tentative suggestion. It definitely challenges the purely mechanistic view.
It really does. Okay, let's shift to microphysics. This seems even stranger, connecting psychology to subatomic particles. They seem worlds apart.
Initially, yes. Psychology is inner, subjective. Microphysics is outer, supposedly objective. But the chapter points to a surprising historical link.
Which is?
Many core physics concepts, space, time, matter, energy, even the idea of a particle, actually started out as intuitive, sometimes almost mythological, archetypal ideas in ancient Greece.
Really? Like the atom?
Exactly. Leucippus and Democritus came up with the atom, an indivisible unit, way back. Our modern atom is different, of course, but the basic intuition of fundamental units persisted and evolved. Or the Stoic idea of tonos, a kind of inherent tension or energy in everything, maybe a distant echo of our modern concept of energy. These early intuitions, probably shaped by archetypal thinking, laid some groundwork.
So even science's building blocks might have psychological roots. The chapter mentions Descartes and Kepler, too.
Yeah, even later figures. Descartes justified causality based on God's unchanging nature, a theological, maybe archetypal idea. Kepler argued for 3 dimensions because of the Trinity.
Wow.
It shows how even rigorous science wasn't totally separate from these deeper mental patterns. Heisenberg's famous quote comes to mind. In studying nature, man encounters himself. Our concepts are shaped by our need for satisfying explanations.
So our inner makeup influences how we even frame scientific questions. This leads to complementarity, right, in physics, and how it mirrors Jung's view of conscious-unconscious.
This is a key parallel. Microphysics found that things like light behave as both particles and waves. You can measure one aspect or the other, but not both at once.
And the act of measuring affects the outcome.
Crucially, yes. The observer and their chosen experiment are part of the system. You can't get a purely objective picture at the quantum level. It's impossible in principle.
Okay.
Classical physics had deterministic laws. Microphysics has probabilities, primary possibilities. And while physicists accept the conscious observer's role, Pauli wondered if the unconscious observer might also play a part. It's still an open question.
And the parallel with Jung is?
Jung saw the conscious and unconscious mind as a complementary pair, too. Unconscious stuff changes when it becomes conscious. Analyzing a dream changes it. And expanding consciousness changes the unconscious.
So interaction changes both sides.
Right. And just like quantum particles, the unconscious can only really be described approximately, often using seemingly paradoxical ideas. Its deep nature is elusive.
It feels like the very act of looking changes the thing being looked at, whether it's a particle or a thought. The chapter then connects archetypes directly to Pauli's primary possibilities.
Yes. Pauli suggested Jung's archetypes. These basic patterns are like primary possibilities for psychic reactions. There aren't strict laws saying exactly how an archetype will appear, just tendencies.
Probabilistic, not deterministic.
Exactly. And William James's idea comes back here, the unconscious as a field.
Right, where psychological stuff appears in an ordered way, like iron filings in a magnetic field.
And the chapter suggests that what we consciously accept as rational might depend on whether it clicks with these pre-existing patterns in the unconscious field.
So the unconscious has an inherent order that influences conscious understanding. The examples from Gauss and Poincaré really illustrate that, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Gauss finding a number theory rule like a flash of lightning, not through conscious steps. Poincaré literally feeling like he was watching his mathematical ideas bumping around in his head until they clicked into place.
Like observing your own unconscious solving the problem.
Exactly. It shows the unconscious isn't just storage. It's an active, creative, organizing force, even in logic-heavy fields.
And this relates to Jung looking at meaning or purpose, not just cause and effect.
Right. He asked what for alongside why. And interestingly, modern physics also seems to be shifting towards looking for fundamental connections rather than just deterministic laws, a parallel trend.
This theme of interconnectedness just keeps coming up.
Yeah.
Okay, looking ahead, the chapter introduces this idea of the unus mundus. What is that?
Well, Pauli and Jung thought the concept of the unconscious would impact all life sciences. And there's this growing call for a real dialogue between science and psychology.
Because of these unexpected parallels.
Exactly. They hint at something really profound, maybe an ultimate underlying unity, a oneness beneath both the physical and psychological realities we study, a psychophysical unity.
And that's the unus mundus.
Yes. Jung borrowed the term, envisioning it as this original, undifferentiated reality, the one world, before before matter and psyche split apart.
Hmm.
He, Pauli, and Newman developed this, noting how archetypes, especially in synchronicity, seem psychoid, almost bridging psyche and matter. Synchronicity itself involves inner states and outer events lining up meaningfully.
Suggesting archetypes aren't just in here.
Right, they seem connected to out there, too. But the chapter stresses, these are just initial hints. We need way more research on the matter-psyche link before we get too speculative.
A huge, mind-expanding idea, though. The chapter then points to mathematics, specifically basic axioms, as a fruitful area for this research. Why math?
Jung felt that digging into math's foundations, things like infinity, the continuum, what Pauli called primary mathematical intuitions, could reveal deep truths about how psyche relates to reality's structure.
And that Hannah Arendt quote fits here, about math studying the human mind structure now.
Exactly. Which raises the Jungian question, conscious mind structure, or unconscious too?
And given Gauss and Poincaré.
It strongly suggests the unconscious plays a huge role. Van Woerden concluded the unconscious isn't just associative, it makes intuitive, often accurate judgments, even in math.
Which leads to thinking about natural numbers themselves, 1, 2, 3, not just tools for counting.
The chapter argues they're psychologically profound. Primary intuitions may be a priori ideas built into us. Yes, we use them to count, but they also feature in ancient divination, which Jung studied via synchronicity.
And the way we think about them feels compelled, almost.
Right, like the uniqueness of 2 as the only even prime. It suggests numbers are archetypal representations, emerging spontaneously from the unconscious, not just conscious inventions.
So numbers exist both out there as quantity and in here as mental concepts.
Precisely. Their dual nature makes them a potential bridge, a tangible link between matter and psyche, a key research area, Jung thought.
It sounds like Jung approached all this with real intellectual humility, despite the bold ideas. The chapter emphasizes his scientific attitude.
Absolutely. It stresses his ideas are a starting point, an evolving outlook, not a fixed doctrine. He had this rare freedom from bias, but also immense respect for life's complexity.
And he was cautious about publishing.
Extremely. Years of checking, self-doubt. What might seem like vagueness was often modesty, keeping the door open for discovery, respecting the mystery. Life wasn't a solved puzzle for him.
That openness seems key. So wrapping up, what's the ultimate value or purpose of these ideas, according to the chapter?
Well, the value of creative ideas is how they unlock connections we couldn't see before, letting us delve deeper into life's mysteries.
Right.
And the conviction here is that Jung's ideas do exactly that. They can help us find and interpret new facts in science and in our own lives, leading towards, ideally, a more balanced, ethical, broader consciousness.
And the goal of this exploration
Is fulfilled if it sparks your own interest, If the listener feels encouraged to investigate their own unconscious. That journey always starts with looking within.
So this deep dive really reveals this incredible, sometimes surprising interconnectedness. Our inner symbolic world and the outer world, even science, seem linked in ways we're just beginning to grasp.
It offers a much richer, more complex view of ourselves and the universe.
Definitely. It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? If there is this underlying oneness, how might our understanding of everything physics, biology, psychology change in the future? A lot to think about.
Indeed. And with that, I think we've covered the essential ground of science and the unconscious.
We have. A truly fascinating journey. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.